So we're picking up chapter 32 with deficits. This term refers to the fact that the federal government was spending more money than it had. So in this point in the chapter, we are at the presidency of George H.W. Bush, and he had pledged that there would be no new taxes, and he had proposed to cut capital gains taxes, but the problem was that this ran up against the mounting deficit. The end of the Cold War did not bring any money for us. There wasn't like a peace dividend. The Persian Gulf War and the invasion of Panama also were very costly. And in addition, Congress didn't want to cut military bases or cut funding for defense contractors. You can't reduce popular programs like Medicare or Social Security without angering a huge percentage of the population, so that seemed impossible as well. Also, we were giving aid to the newly liberated countries of Eastern Europe, and all of this served to create a burden on the federal treasury. Another drag on the federal treasury was the collapse of hundreds of federally insured savings and loan institutions. These governments were federally insured, meaning if they collapsed, the people who were doing business with these banks would get their money from the government. And so as these savings and loan institutions collapse, it was a huge burden on the taxpayers ultimately. In order to try to prevent being closed down or going out of business, these institutions would buy or invest in risky junk bonds or real estate. And a junk bond is like a high-yield, high-risk security that is typically issued by a company trying to raise money quickly so that they can finance a takeover. And when the junk bond market collapsed and the real estate market had stalled or at least slowed down, hundreds of these savings and loans went under. And again, because their deposits were insured by the federal government, the failures cost the taxpayers billions of dollars. So during this time period, the Whitewater scandal and the Clintons, in 1977, Bill Clinton was the Attorney General of Arkansas, and of course his wife Hillary Rodham Clinton. They had joined with another couple to borrow money to develop vacation homes in the Ozark Mountains. And the other couple was James and Susan McDougal. And this proposed development, named Whitewater, failed. Well, James McDougal had another company. He owned a savings and loans company, so he illegally covered the losses from Whitewater with funds from his savings and loan company that he owned. And in 1989, McDougal's savings and loan company collapsed, and it cost the federal government $60 million to reimburse the depositors. Well, 3 years later, 1992, there were federal investigators that claimed that the Clintons had been potential beneficiaries of illegal activities by McDougal and his savings and loan company. And by this point, Clinton was running for the Democratic nomination for president in the election of 1992. The financial dealings were really complicated, though, and most voters either were unable to understand or unwilling to follow the story. So Whitewater was sort of shoved into the background until, well, a national tabloid reported that Clinton had, for years, engaged in an extramarital affair with a lady named Jennifer Flowers, who confirmed the story several days later. Clinton appeared on 60 Minutes and denied the story but asked for forgiveness, sending sort of a mixed message there, but this appeal worked, and Clinton won the nomination and improved his chances by picking Senator Al Gore as his running mate. So by this point, George H.W. Bush had served one term, and he was actually challenged for the Republican nomination by a guy named Patrick Buchanan, who was a very outspoken conservative. Not to mention Ross Perot, who is a billionaire from Texas, said that both parties had lost touch with the people and announced that he was running as an independent candidate. So Bush easily won the Republican nomination, But Buchanan and Perot had inflicted serious damage on Bush and the Republican Party. And so Clinton's campaign came out and, of course, attacked Bush's handling of the economy, how he should have raised taxes to prevent deficits and things like that. And so Clinton won a plurality of popular votes cast and a commanding victory in the Electoral College by promising that he would change health care, he would reform the welfare system, and he would balance the budget. So Bill Clinton won the election of 1992. So Bill Clinton set out to reverse many of the policies of the Reagan-Bush era. He actually did reverse policies of the Bush administration when he signed a revived family leave bill into law and authorized the use of fetal tissue for research. He also solidified the pro-choice majority in the Supreme Court when he appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg to replace Byron White on the Supreme Court. During the campaign, Clinton had promised to deal with health care and the budget deficit. He proposed cutting the deficit by $500 billion in 5 years. He would do that half by cutting spending and half by raising taxes. Even some Democrats balked at Clinton's budget, but he ended up having to accept major changes to the budget. As far as the health care reform, he appointed a committee led by his wife, Hillary, to reform the health care system. And the committee's proposal seemed more complicated and more costly than what was already in place. So the plan failed to generate support from the medical profession, the insurance industry, and many ordinary people. And so the healthcare reform plan never even came to a vote in Congress. So the emergence of the Republican majority. So in spite of Clinton's ability to brush aside the whole Whitewater thing during his campaign, the scandal began to gnaw at his presidency. And public pressure eventually forced the Attorney General, Janet Reno, to appoint a special prosecutor, Kenneth Starr, to look into it. And more troubles followed for Clinton when an employee of the state of Arkansas, Paula Corbin Jones, accused Clinton of sexually harassing her when he was governor of Arkansas. And so all of this gave Republicans hope for the congressional elections of 1994. Because even though there was a Democratic president, of course, if the Republican has a majority in the House, he can't really pass very much without his approval. So all of this, the rise of his scandal, or I guess the rise in attention toward his scandals, gave the Republicans, I guess, hope that they would win a congressional majority. And so they were led by Newt Gingrich of Georgia, and the Republicans came up with an ambitious program of their own that promised to cut federal debt, reduce income taxes, and turn over many of the functions of the federal government to the states, and also to eliminate some of the environmental regulations. Well, Republicans ended up winning a majority in both houses, so they won control of the House and the Senate, and led by Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, the new Republican majority in Congress passed almost all of their provisions that I just mentioned. They were called Contract with America. And Clinton vetoed the budget passed by Congress. And so both sides refused to compromise. The government ran out of money and shut down all but essential services. So the election of 1996 came around, and the public didn't blame the president for the government shutdown. They blamed Congress. And so the president's standing in the polls rose. Clinton also benefited from an economic upturn that began in 1992. And so for this election, he faced no opposition for renomination. He was the sole Democratic nominee. And so the Republicans nominated Bob Dole of Kansas, who was the majority leader in the Senate, and he failed to capture the imagination of the voters. He had proposed to cut taxes by 15%. He raised the issue of Clinton's character, but still Clinton won a decisive victory. The Republicans did retain control of both houses of Congress, though. So Clinton denied all allegations of womanizing. A judge required him to testify in a lawsuit that was brought by Paula Corbin Jones, alleging that he had made improper sexual advances to her. And in an effort to support their case, Jones's lawyers tried to show that Clinton had a history of making sexual advances toward women. In the process, they subpoenaed a former White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. And both Clinton and Lewinsky denied that they had the affair under oath, and to the media, Clinton told a news conference, quote, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky," end quote. Hillary, of course, denounced these allegations as a part of a vast right-wing conspiracy. However, Lewinsky had confided in Linda Tripp, who had recorded their conversations. And so Tripp turned the tapes over to the prosecutor, Kenneth Starr, and Clinton and Lewinsky appeared to have lied under oath. And so under the threat of an indictment for perjury, Lewinsky repudiated her early testimony, and when Starr called Clinton to testify before a grand jury, Clinton admitted to inappropriate intimate contact, but responded with legalistic obfuscation. Basically, he obscured what he said to make it seem more difficult to understand. Well, Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House, decided to make Clinton's behavior the focus of the fall elections. However, it didn't work. Republicans lost seats, and Gingrich ended up resigning as Speaker of the House. Kenneth Starr submitted a report that said that Clinton's behavior warranted that the House of Representatives consider impeachment. Well, the House voted to impeach Clinton, but the Senate acquitted him. So technically he was impeached by the House, but they didn't get the two-thirds majority needed to convict and remove him from office. So Clinton remained in office. So what legacy did he leave? He was president for 8 years. So this is just kind of a look at all the things that he did. Clinton's presidency did coincide with the longest economic boom in American history. And most historians say that he deserves credit for the prosperity of the 90s. He reduced the deficit, which kept interest rates down and made people invest in the economy. The surging economy resulted in the lowest unemployment since the 60s, and inflation fell to levels unseen since the 1950s. And so this, in general, created greater income for the people and the government. By the 2000 fiscal year, the surplus hit $237 billion. Clinton also promoted globalization of the economy. He believed that American corporations could prevail in global markets, which was essentially correct. Not all prospered in the new global economy. There were union leaders who were bitter about trying to compete against convict labor in China or sweatshop workers in Indonesia and Malaysia working for next to nothing. And some complained that worldwide economic growth threatened the environment. In terms of foreign affairs, Clinton had sort of a mixed record. He failed to assemble an international force to prevent ethnic cleansing. In Bosnia, the Serbian troops there were trying to remove all Bosnian Muslims. He was unable to prevent that from happening. An American intervention in Somalia resulted in the death of 15 American commandos and ended in failure. On the other hand, a bombing campaign by NATO was able to prevent Yugoslavia from crushing the Muslim province of Kosovo. And Clinton also failed to achieve a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So in terms of foreign affairs, some good, some bad. Whatever the successes and failures of his administration, he will probably best be remembered for his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. After all, that is that's what dominated the SNL years when Clinton was president. So the economic boom and the internet. So Clinton managed to survive the scandals and the impeachment thanks in part to the robust economy. There were new technologies coming out during this time. You had cell phones, genetic engineering, and this contributed to the booming prosperity. The most important development was probably the internet. And in 1995, software giant Microsoft introduced the point-and-click Windows operating system that made it easy for IBM and IBM-compatible computers to issue complex commands. And so some people thought of ways to make money through the internet. One of those was a guy named Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon to sell books on the internet. He's now worth $46.7 billion. Venture capitalists poured money into new internet ventures. So dot-com stocks rose rapidly, even though very few companies made many profits early on. In the spring of 2000, there was a wave of selling that hit these technology stocks really hard. But this was temporary because it wouldn't be long before dot-com stocks would be on the rise again. So we'll go ahead and conclude our video there and pick up in the next one with the 2000 election.